Welcome to this week's episode of On Record PR. I am one of your hosts, Jennifer Simpson Carr, and today I am joined by my amazing teammate, Maria Aronson, and our guest today, Eric Dodson Greenberg, Executive Vice President, General Counsel, and Corporate Secretary of Cox Media Group. Good morning to you both. And Eric, welcome. We're excited to have you.
Thank you. I'm great. I'm really glad to be here.
Good morning.
So, we're at a really interesting moment in the legal industry. Eric, I know you spoke about this at the Legal Marketing Association conference last month. There was no shortage of conversation about AI. And what's becoming increasingly clear is that it is fundamentally in real time changing how legal work gets done, but also how value is defined. So, Eric, your career path has taken you from private practice, which we'll get into, is where you cross paths with Maria, and now into a senior leadership role. Along the way, you've also become a thoughtful voice on where the profession is headed, and lately, a thoughtful voice on AI and the evolving role of legal judgment. So, before we get into AI and how that is changing things, I'd love to go back to your earlier years in private practice.
Sure.
At what point did you begin to realize you wanted to have a voice in the broader legal profession and be a contributor to the conversation about your work and where the industry is headed?
I think it really corresponds to being a GC. I think the GC has a really important role and has the standing as a client to contribute to how people think about it. I mean, ultimately, the profession is a services industry, and I think those of us on the receiving side of the service have an important role in shaping that. And I think it's a real opportunity. I do appreciate that as someone who was at Big Law and was a partner, I have insight and empathy for the constraints and the aspirations and the demands on a private practice attorney and what it's like to work for a range of different clients. And I try to bring that to my role as a client, but I think in the bigger picture, that also means helping to comment more broadly about the profession and its direction, not just speaking to lawyers in private practice, which I certainly do, but also to fellow general counsel. And I think at a very high level, there's a growing antagonism between private practice attorneys and in-house. There's sort of a mutual suspicion on the in-house side that we're getting charged more and more, and that law firms are really focused on rates and realization, and that therefore we have to be extra scrupulous and skeptical. And then I think in turn, law firms react to that and say, well, they're going to ask for discounts. So we need to ask for more and try and realize as much as we can to preempt the discount discussion. And that just feeds this negative spiral. And, it's in social psychology, when you have that kind of, I think it's called a negative dyad, the only solution is for someone to step out of that. And to a large degree, Jennifer, that's what I've tried to do, is to step out of that, both as a client and as someone who was former partner, and comment and observe that dynamic and try and shape it in a better direction.
That's an incredible perspective because what you've described has been a big part of the conversation. Maria and I both were in-house at different law firms for many years. And that was a big part of the push and pull that we dealt with. So I appreciate that that's the motivator. And so kind of in keeping with that, there is a lot of talk right now about the pressures and I think some anxiety on the law firm side about pricing pressure, where AI fits into this commoditization of work. And so I think big picture, my question is, what do you think law firms either misunderstand or need to know at this moment about what in-house counsel need right now?
Look, there's so much changing. I think it's hard to say, but the one thing I think that I can say with certainty is what's needed is transparency about what's happening and what we don't understand. And I think everyone is afraid to have that conversation. And, I've raised in writing and in conversations the idea of greater transparency about AI use from the very micro level of we've raised with my legal ops colleague, we've raised um, billing task codes. I mean, you don't get more granular than that. To bigger picture of let's have a conversation about how you're using AI and so forth. And there certainly are people who are really receptive to that. What I'm more struck by, however, is how many people are resistant to that. And the reflexive reaction that I see is, aha, this is a trick. This is a trap door for a conversation about discounts. And when you
Mm.
say you want to talk about AI, what you really want to talk about is discounts. And my view is that it is not a trapdoor for a discussion about discounts. It's an open door for a conversation about value. And that's a conversation that law firms ought to want to have 7 days a week. And AI is an opportunity to have that conversation. And I think not only are they missing out on the opportunity to talk about value, they're sowing the seeds for suspicion that will ultimately hurt them. So, is it a conversation about discounts? Certainly in part. But the thing that always surprises me when we talk about, like, well, we'd like to see more in the bills about AI, because, you're going to look for discounts. We look for discounts in every bill. If you're writing down your time with a number next to it, that's a discussion about discounts. That's why we read the bills. So I just see it as a matter of degree, not a difference in kind. The difference in kind is that there is a whole new category of value creation that we could talk about and that you ought to want to talk about. And that ultimately is going to be the thing that distinguishes one firm from another. So I think the firms that say, here's how we're using it, here's how we're creating richer analysis, how we're delivering service faster and cheaper, here's how we're finding patterns in litigation testimony, in documents, how we're generating an issues list, how we're using our vast knowledge base in our experience on M&A or this regulatory area. And you are going to get the benefit of that knowledge base because we're using AI to mine that in a way that's anonymized for our clients, but available to our lawyers to bring you new insights and strategies. The people doing that are going to be the winners in the future. And those that say, well, I'm going to do the same old thing, maybe a little bit faster, maybe a little bit cheaper, or maybe I'm not even going to talk about that because I'm afraid,
Mm.
those are the future losers.
How does that value too? Because you've given us some wonderful examples of that value, but how does all that also come to play in the relationship? How does that drive your relationship with the actual law firms that you're working with on a regular basis?
Maria, I think that's one of the great ironies of this AI era is that it makes old-fashioned talking and relationships and the human element of relationships, I think, even more important. So it's a conversation. And I think one of the challenges in AI is this obsession, not an inappropriate one, but it is at the level of obsession about ROI. And I think one of the things, and by the way, it's important to let me be clear. I care about ROI. I have to deliver a budget. I have to meet a budget. I have to show why we've used the technology, why we've picked a law firm for that matter. But at the end of the day, one of the things that's fundamentally idiosyncratic about what we do as opposed to sales is that often our value is the dog that didn't bark. And it is very hard to show the ROI on the dog that didn't bark. So we've always had this challenge. And we've always met the challenge, I think, at best, by telling stories. So the dog that didn't bark is not a number, it's a story, it's an illustration. And we are good at that. And the AI era creates new kinds of value that requires new kinds of storytelling. And so I think the irony is that the ROI for new tech is going to be told in Microsoft Word, not in Microsoft Excel. some of it will appear there, but some of it is going to be in an email that explains what you've done, or more apt in a Zoom, or better still, a lunch conversation where you sit down and say, here's how we're working now. I know that there are clients who are calling in law firms to talk about how they're using AI. I think law firms ought to ask for that conversation and say, here's what we're doing. We're excited to talk to you about AI. And I think that's how you show value, is that you use it to embroider and enrich a human relationship. And I think when we talk about technology and solely think of it in terms of tech efficiency, faster, cheaper, we're missing out on the whole element. All of that is in the service of a relationship between a lawyer and a client. And that is fundamentally a human relationship. And the technology has to be in service of that. Just as a good memo that was typewritten by a secretary in 1991 was also about that. We're still telling the same stories about value. We still are nurturing relationships. We're just creating value within that relationship in entirely new ways, and it requires new storytelling.
So we hear that general counsel want to be asked for their feedback. They want to have these conversations. And yet, I'm sure, Maria, we've both been in positions where we give that advice, whether it's in-house or even now, at the agency. And there's a lot of resistance and feedback from the private practice attorneys saying, I don't want to bother them, or I know how the relationship stands. And it sounds like that's actually, Eric, not the case. What I'm hearing from you is that you want to be asked, you want proactive outreach saying, let's have a conversation to be transparent about what's changing in the industry and how it's impacting our work together.
I strongly agree with both parts of that,
Okay.
because they're both autobiographical. The answer to your question is yes, we do want to have that conversation. And what I will also confess is that as a partner at a law firm, I was reluctant, and I think the reluctant is really fearful of having that conversation. One of the great things about being an adult is not really being evaluated and getting graded anymore. And all of us, and I'm an employee now, we have evaluations, and they are not our favorite day of the year, even when they go well. And I think partners who are generally not graded and evaluated, other than to the degree that they get a memo saying what their compensation is, which is often a pretty opaque connection to their performance and is often more about data that they already know rather than other details. And so it's sort of not, it doesn't feel like a personal valuation in the same way. I think partners at law firms quite rightly luxuriate in not being graded anymore. And I get that. I got that. And I think that's the issue. I think there's a view that, well, if we just keep providing excellent legal work and the client has called us back, that's all we need to do. And it's not true. And I will say on both sides of the coin, obviously the most acute aspect of that is to talk about billing. And as a partner in a law firm, I certainly made a lot of hard calls about bills. And I will tell you that there is not one single time that I wanted to make that call. And there's not one single time that I regretted it. And I don't mean I didn't regret it because it turned out they said, oh, it's a lot of money, but it was like, those were hard conversations. I didn't hang up thinking like, oh, that went better than I thought. I hung up thinking, I'm glad we had that conversation. And I think that's an illustration of a bigger picture about getting feedback and having that conversation. It is hard. It is undesired. It is something that you want to avoid. And I think as adults, as professionals, we're capable of avoiding hard conversations, but they are almost inevitably worth having. And hard conversations that you don't have are resentments waiting to happen. And that's the other side of this is I had a law firm that we worked with. They were quite good, and their billing practices were quite unsatisfying. And I will criticize myself. I should have opened a hard conversation as the client, but I liked the firm. I valued their work. I didn't want to upset them, and I was reluctant to do it. But of course, as my wife would tell you, it was quite obvious that I was unhappy. I just didn't say it. My wife always says, if you think there's a choice between telling people what you really think or keeping it to yourself so they don't know, the second is not really an available choice for you. They will know. And this law firm knew, and they raised it to their credit. And I would say after 30 minutes of me saying, and another thing, and what about the time, we got to a really productive conversation. And that firm continues to be our go-to firm. They continue to do great work, and they also are among the law firms that have the best and most satisfying billing practice for us. And it got fixed that day, and it has been excellent ever since. And I think that captures the nature of this. I didn't want to have the conversation. Partner, I think I give him credit. I think he understood it had to happen. I'm sure he didn't hang up saying, well, that went great, but it did. It did go great, but it was a hard conversation. But the result is a much richer, and I mean that in all the senses of the word, a richer relationship between us. And it is a result of that hard conversation.
I think that you bring up some really good points with having the hard conversations. And some of those hard conversations, I think, within law firms also happen between people within law firms too,
Yeah.
right? Practice group leaders and their attorneys, sometimes even the marketing department and attorneys. You know, what was a really great learning experience for you to be able to communicate better with your clients, Eric?
With clients or with colleagues within the firm?
Both, if you want.
Well, one thing I would say about law firms is that there is a peculiar math that goes on within law firms where origination or other kinds of credit are at issue. And what I have seen, and I think this is a real phenomena, is partners who will fight to the death to retain 100% of zero rather than share 50% of something. There is an element of control that is very important to partners. There's a fear about expanding the relationship, even though the economic incentives of that could not be more vivid. But the human vulnerability about losing control of a client relationship or of having to share credit drives a lot of people to be very reluctant. And I think there is a mythology at a lot of firms about collegiality and sharing. It's not universally true by any means, and I would suggest it's where people embrace it. They're the people who are making a lot of money and leading law firms, but there are a lot of people doing just fine, and they're very happy having 100% of just fine rather than 70% of something better. And I think that is a phenomena that hurts the law firm. It also hurts the client. It is effectively limiting my choice by you're not introducing other opportunities to us. And as a client, I would just say, I think people just underestimate the value of having conversations. I'll tell you, somebody reached out to me yesterday and asked me to come in and meet with their colleagues. And I'm busy, and that sort of means I showed up and kind of didn't really know what the meeting was going to be about. And it was a general conversation about what's going on in our industry and what our challenges are and what they do. It's a pretty amorphous agenda, and it was a pretty damn good meeting. I met people I didn't know. I left with an understanding of what their capabilities are. Am I calling them on Monday with a new assignment? No. Might I call them 10 Mondays from now because something has come up and it registers with that conversation? A very high maybe. And I think people just underestimate the value of that. I think there are a lot of things we can say about the billable hour, but I think one of the less obvious ones, but more impactful, is that it really keeps people from thinking strategically about the human relationship. And I don't mean that in a kind of kumbaya, like we should, bedazzle our phones together. I mean, you should have conversations about what's going on, what you're hearing. Let's share that. I think that that's really valuable. Yes, I'm busy. Yes, you need to bill all of your time. But I don't think playing golf together or going to a conference is quite as valuable as having lunch and having a conversation or having a cup of coffee. And I think people wildly underestimate that. And I think the pressure that firms put on lawyers to stay focused on the billable hour is actually kind of penny wise and pound foolish. The story that comes to mind as I say that is a very senior associate we worked with at a very, very top firm. It's one of the best lawyers we worked with. And I work with a private equity sponsor who is not a big fan of lawyers. And he mentions that to me 1 to 2 to 30 times a month. And he liked this guy. He's like, this is one of the 2 lawyers I like. And I liked him. He did an amazing job. We never heard from him again after the deal finished. We found out just looking online, he'd made partner. This guy, the pressures on someone who's just became a partner to build their practice.
Mhm.
This guy could have called either one of us up and stayed in touch with us, and we would have been his client. Not the next day, but a year later, we had another matter that would have been a fit for him, and we'd lost touch with him. I suspect that guy's doing just fine. I suspect that he is getting a lot of business from his very successful firm. I also suspect he's a service partner, and we would have been his client. And I think law firms are designed to say, you're doing great because you're a really busy service partner, rather than go spend an hour and a half with these guys having lunch with them and turning them into your client. And I think in life, but I think also law firm partners are day traders. They are focused on the volatility and value of the work on any given day. And they do not click that minus button on the stock tracker that takes you out from the day to the month to the year to the 5 years where you see a big long trend. And I think that's one of the problems is I think law firms and partners often think of themselves as relationship focused. They even have that name built that I'm a relationship partner. But I think they frequently actually don't nurture a long-term investment. They focus on the value of the day trade, and it's a big mistake.
And it's interesting because a takeaway that I'd like to point out to our listeners is that everything that you have described in this way is not replaceable by any tool or technology. That
100%.
will never go away.
100%. Look, there's some work that is going to be done by AI, and I do think there is a kind of industrial legal work that's now being done through high leverage use of associates, which is a mainstay of the big law model. I think that is going to be disrupted. But the reason why that's going to be disrupted, it is commoditizable and it is replaceable. The judgment piece, the trust piece, the value piece, AI is in support of that. It is not a replacement for it. It is a supplement to it. And I think that's where the longer term opportunity is.
So you've talked in your writing about the tension between training and development. And so I'd love to continue the conversation on that. How do you feel so given that the apprenticeship models are changing and this leveraged model, we're hearing now that many firms aren't billing for first through fifth year associates based on the request of clients. I'm not
Yeah.
sure if you have that experience or have heard that as well, but how do you recommend or see the profession changing in a way that responsibly trains junior attorneys so that they can have the development and skill set that they need in this AI era?
I actually am incredibly optimistic about training in the AI era. I think the premise that I would challenge is the relationship between leverage and training, which I think is a fiction. I was sent to a warehouse to read documents. I did learn something. I did get something out of it. I don't celebrate that as sort of the pivotal moment in my growth as a lawyer, nor do I recall being mentored about it. I recalled being alone, looking at documents. And I think there is a real element of nostalgia that replaces analysis when it comes to this mentorship and training issue. Will there be fewer associates needed on a matter? Quite possibly. That's its own issue. But let's talk about the associates who are at the firm and how they're trained, which is really the question. I think associates at law firms are going to now have access to a wealth of information, analysis, and data by being prompt engineers, by being liberal arts graduates who can think by analogy, who can spot a material issue or a defect in logic, who now have the unbelievably amplified pattern recognition power of AI, but are themselves trained to understand the significance of a pattern. And then take that to a partner who has vast experience and well-developed judgment and have a conversation that puts those two things together. The story that I think of is of litigator told me about a healthcare fraud trial that they had. They represented the pharmaceutical company. It was an issue of whether sales reps had misled buyers. I actually don't know the details, but that's the gist. And the AI tool studied all of the testimony and said, you should argue the pattern here, what will sell with the jury, is that these sales reps did not understand the law. They did not realize what they were doing was wrong. And the litigators of the firm said that is a terrible idea. Ignorance of the law is not a good argument, and it will open us to an argument that they did anything to make a sale, and it'll backfire on us. The jury, it was a hung jury, but 4 of 12 jurors went their way and hung their way, which is quite remarkable. And they interviewed those jurors, and to a person, they said, well, these sales reps didn't understand what they were doing was wrong. The AI had it right. But the lawyers may have also had it right. And that's what I love about the story. It is both vivid and ambiguous. It's vivid in terms of the AI correctly anticipating how humans would perceive certain information, which is an incredible insight. But it's also not at all clear. It's ambiguous as to whether the lawyers made the wrong choice or not. I think a lot of lawyers would say, no, that was the right call. And maybe they played it just right. They hinted at that argument without leaning into it. That conversation that I imagine between a younger lawyer saying, here's what the AI shows us, and the partner saying, here are the risks with that. To me, that is a paradigm of a great mentor relationship, of great training. And so I envision AI as enabling conversations like that. The truth of the matter is, when I got a markup from a partner, they didn't sit next to me and explain it and say, this is why I wrote misinterpreted rather than interpreted, and this is why I added a proviso, and this is why it's a covenant and not. I had to sit. That's how I trained myself. Now, did I learn from the partner? You bet. Some of the best experiences I have had are from learning from partners. But let's not kid ourselves that they sat down and put their arm around me and said, let me expound on my wisdom. They didn't. And we all know there are certainly associates who would have handed that to their secretary. I'm dating myself, mind you, but said, could you input the partner's edits? And they would have learned nothing. And there are people who did that, and they were not successful. And then there were the people who sat and reverse engineered the comments to understand. Well, now that's going to happen as a result of AI or through AI. The AI is going to explain it to us. And at Stanford, Professor Megan Ma is creating AI agents that will do that mentoring. And so I am very optimistic about the training opportunity that AI will enable, both indirectly and directly. And so I'm very optimistic about that.
This episode is brought to you by Furia Rubel Communications, a public relations and marketing agency serving law firms and businesses worldwide. With an expert team positioned throughout the U.S. and supported by an international faculty, Furia Rubel enhances our clients' brands through integrated communications by providing expert guidance in crisis management and high-profile litigation, protecting brand and reputation, and supporting internal marketing teams. To learn more, visit furiarubel.com.
Eric, you were talking too a little bit about your career and where you had actually come to a new capability within your career. Can you
Yeah.
talk about that evolution and when that sort of happened for you?
Do you mean in terms of AI or as a corporate
No,
lawyer?
as a corporate lawyer, when you were, I guess, either an associate
Yeah.
or a partner and you felt like you came into your own.
Sure. Gosh, I will tell you, I started out as a litigator. I was very successful in moot court. I'm a pretty good talker. So everybody told me you're a natural litigator. But, as with many things in big law, it's a little bit different than understood in law school. So being a good talker, I think in the end is a element of being a litigator, not its primary thing. Maybe if you're a U.S. attorney or you're in court all the time, but that's not the big law experience. And that's a long way of saying I both hated being a litigator and I was thoroughly average at it. I'm a hard worker and a reasonably smart guy, and I did fine, but I was not great. And if there was any doubt about that, my evaluations made very clear that I was just fine. And I didn't like it. I wasn't that great at it. And one of the things I really remember, everybody said it, and it's such a cliche at a law firm, you have to take ownership. That's how you succeed. You take ownership. I just thought, what the fuck does that mean? Take owner. I do what I'm told. Tell me to do something and I'll do it. I'll do it as best as I can. And when I started to do corporate transactional work, I had an issue where the deal had some element that had some regulatory implication. I don't remember any details other than on my own initiative, seeking out a regulatory lawyer and talking to him about it and solving the problem. And knowing that I'd spotted this nuance and I'd found the right person outside of my area, sort of part of the vast capability of the law firm. I found the right guy with this nuanced expertise and found a way to incorporate it into the deal. And I remember in that moment thinking, I wonder if that's what they mean by taking ownership. And of course it is, and I did. And that was the turning point for me. And as much as as with many things, there's a reason why it's a cliche. It's fundamentally true. And because I didn't like what I did, I never took ownership. I just, and frankly, as a partner, I once had someone come to me for advice and they said, I don't understand why I'm not being more successful. I do everything that they tell me to do. And I said, well, there's your problem. And he's like, what are you talking about? I said, if you do everything they tell you to do and you do it well, you will not be fired, but you will not be promoted. And that's the key. And I think I had trouble understanding that because I just couldn't envision what taking ownership looked like. But once I did understand it. And to be honest, things turned around for me overnight. And I had known a couple of other associates where I had seen that happen. I didn't understand it, but I'd sort of known they were sort of just in the mix. And suddenly they were a star. And that's kind of the switch that flipped for me in that moment.
I'm so thrilled we had this conversation because I think we've all seen so many headlines that, if you will, put this dark cloud of doom and gloom around the profession and AI. And I think that, Eric, hearing you and reading your thought leadership, you're approaching this from the complete opposite perspective, which I hope will encourage our listeners to step back after they hear this episode and say, there's real change that I can make within my firm. There is an opportunity to show value and position myself different than my competitors. And I so much appreciate you sharing that with us. because I think that you're uncovering an opportunity, which is what we like to say, opportunity in crisis. But for those who may be feeling like a lot is coming at them and a lot is changing every day and not really sure what to do with all this information. So thank you so much again for agreeing to join us.
Thanks for
Maria,
having me.
of course. Thank you, Maria, for joining us for the second episode in a row and for introducing us to Eric. I've really enjoyed the conversation.
Maria is one of the important people in my own career. We talked about when the switch flipped as an associate at a big law firm, but I also joined Maria's firm as a not a I don't know, probably wasn't a young partner, but now it feels that way. But I certainly was inexperienced with what was then a new world of lawyers being much more savvy about being in media and using public relations techniques, communications techniques of putting yourself out there. I grew up in an element where you didn't ever engage with the press out of certainty that you would be misquoted, it would damage your reputation in your career, and you would never work in this town again, which is probably what I said to Maria when she called me. And when I finished saying that, the way I remember is she effectively said, I'm sorry, I didn't listen to what you're saying. I was scheduling 3 interviews with AmLaw and the New York Law Journal. And we went from there. And candidly, that, my being in a conversation like this one ultimately traces back to that conversation. And I think one of the things that lawyers often miss is the wealth of expertise within their firm that is not possessed by a lawyer, but by a professional in a different field that is being made available to them that they don't take advantage of. And we as lawyers are terrific at talking to experts when they're an outside economist, they're a scientist who's helping us understand something. But I think down the hall, particularly in the realm of marketing, are people who are experts in a world of journalism and media that also is rapidly changing. Even in the last 12 months, I feel like, what the amount of coverage is expanding, what's being covered and talked about is changing, and it behooves lawyers who want to be successful to understand that. And I'm grateful, Maria, for that conversation and in my mind, all the things that it made possible afterwards for me.
Well, I'm very grateful too. And we've known each other for what, 15 years now?
Mhm.
Yeah, it's been a long time.
It's
And
been a
I've
long
seen
time.
you, yeah, I've just seen you grow, and it's been an amazing experience to see you with the media now. You're doing something new every day, I feel like, and it's fantastic.
Well,
So,
what I'll say, thank you. And, what people should know is I think like my first year as a GC, we did something was very innovative and I was excited about it. And I thought it could influence the profession. And I called Maria and we hadn't been in touch in a while. I was like, Maria, how do I reach AmLaw? How do I get this idea out there? And she just, I mean, it was pro bono service in the same sense of a lawyer doing pro bono. She took me on as an impoverished client, intellectually impoverished in that case, and connected me with AmLaw, and they ran a story about it. And that was really the beginning of me having a relationship with the media as a general counsel. So I keep doubling down on Maria's expertise, and I'm the better for it.
oh, well, thank you so much. I am just so happy that I get to work with you. You're a joy to work with, and
Oh, thank you.
I'm very
Likewise.
lucky.
And I probably can't put into words how amazing it is to see your relationship and Eric, for you to share what you just did and encourage lawyers who have the resources available to them to tap into the incredible professionals that are available, because we do care deeply about the work that we do and the success of the firms and the attorneys that we support. And to have your vote of trust and encouragement, particularly for Maria, who is such an incredible member of our team, it means a lot. And I do hope that our listeners will take that to heart.
I do too.
Thank you again for joining us. And we will see our listeners in 2 weeks when we release our next episode. Have a great weekend.
Thanks.
Thanks.
On Record PR is produced by Jennifer Simpson-Carr and Matt Henderson, with support from the team at Furia Rubel Communications. This episode is edited by Isabel Horan and Christian Yamula. Visit www.onrecordpr.com for resources and more information.